we need to start making more conscious material choices.
I set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.
Welcome to the Diff. My name is Joe Isles and I'm delighted to be hosting you here for this session at day one of the Diff, hosted by the MacArthur Foundation. And you'll have heard that the global food system is broken. You might have heard that world hunger is on the rise, but approximately a third of all food produced globally goes to waste. So something's got to give. Something's got to change. Things like regenerative agriculture, permaculture. You'll have heard some of these different new practices that are happening in the world of agriculture. One hot topic is insects. Can we eat them? Can we use them to digest our food waste? Can we feed them to other animals or make use of their amazing properties in a new food system that's fit for the future? And someone that knows something about insects is our guest for today's session. It's Jason Drew, who's the co-founder and CEO of AgriProtein, the world's largest insect protein firm. Jason, welcome to the Diff.
Morning.
Good to have you with us. And we'll get stuck in a minute to what AgriProtein is and how it might be part of this new future food system. But just a reminder for our audience, do send your questions in. The Diff is an interactive event. Wherever you're watching, you can send in your questions via the chat box below this video. We've got superstar Seb collecting those and sending those to me throughout the session to put to Jason. So if any of these insect topics get under your skin, then pop them in the chat box and we'll send them to Jason throughout the show. So Jason, let's get started with some of the basics. What is AgriProtein? What does your business do, the insect protein firm?
So in its very simplest form, what we do is we recycle waste nutrients back into usable forms of protein. All we've done in its simplest form is copy a process that has been going on in nature for 108 million years, and we've industrialized it and brought it into the modern age to tackle some of the problems we face in our real world today.
So are you collecting the food waste in cities? How's it working on the ground? You're collecting some food waste, bringing it to a central location, and then where do the insects come in?
Let me explain what a fly farm looks like in its simplest format. If you could imagine a very large cage of flies, we typically in a factory house about 8.4 billion flies in different stages of development. So that's more than one fly for every human on the planet, well, at the moment anyway. And we train those flies to lay eggs in one place. We extract those eggs from the cage and we hatch them and then grow them on different waste substrates depending on the part of the world and which of our business is. And what we're left with at the end is a NPK, that's nitrogen, potassium, phosphate rich soil enhancer, and larvae that we then process into protein and oil for use in predominantly fish farms and shrimp farms across Asia.
Okay, I mean, I have to pause for a moment and ask how you train a fly, because I can't get them out of my kitchen in the summertime. So how does that work?
Well, it's, I mean, the whole process of getting flies to live together is challenging the sorts of numbers that we're talking about. So if you go back to the very beginning, what seemed like a great idea in late 2008, then set about a chain of 5 or 6 years of abject failure as we tried to get large quantities of flies to live together. Of course, you can buy hundreds of books, and in fact, there have been probably thousands of theses on how to kill flies, but none on how to make them live. So getting flies and understanding how to make them live is quite challenging. So our early success came really because I guess I was watching crime scene investigation on the telly with my kids one afternoon, and I saw this person trying to take larvae and flies off a dead body and to age the body. So I rang up the Metropolitan Police, found out who their head of forensic entomology was, who happened to be a South African, and I asked him if he wanted to come and make flies live rather than kill them. He said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So he now heads a team of 52 R&D specialists around the world, just focus on making flies live. So, I mean, give you some sort of basic challenges. So getting flies to live together is one challenge. Getting them to mate is another challenge. We couldn't make flies mate in winter, which was the point at which we really nearly gave the business up. And went outside at the end of winter, so that would be August, September in the Southern Hemisphere, and about to go back and close down our operation, because if it wasn't going to work 365 days a year, it wasn't going to be industrializable into a real solution. And went outside and saw flies starting to mate. It was very early, coming up to dawn in beginning of spring. And we now know that flies mate at dawn, because when there's two flies together, it's like, a discount on a Big Mac. People, the passing bird only has to make 2 extra swoops with its wing to get, a double quantity of flies. What I didn't know is how they knew it was dawn in springtime. And the answer is, having rung up somebody who wasn't thrown out of school and asked them, what could be the solution? They said it's very simple, because the Earth tilts on its axis as it moves around the sun. And this creates summer in the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere at different times. And the frequencies of light to first bend over the surface of the Earth will also differ. So we isolated that down to quite a narrow wavelength of, to the human eye, what looks a bit like blue light. And so then we could take all our breeding inside, away from sunlight, and we could cause breeding whenever we wanted to. It's a bit like turning on the slow song at the end of a school disco. You go into our cages and turn on the blue lights, and that causes mating, winter or summer.
Did you skip that step entirely, just trying some Barry White or something like that?
No, we tried everything from music to humidity to heat to light to noise. And they're actually quite a sensitive creature, and they like to be quiet and have a restful time. They like the nights off, they like the lights out, like some downtime.
And while we're talking about the flies, there is a specific type of fly you use, isn't it? Is it the black soldier fly?
Yes, so we start out using Musca domestica, the house fly, and we still play with some of the other 250,000 species of flies there are around the world. But the BSF, or black soldier fly, is particularly useful in that it really is an omnivore. It'll eat a range of different waste materials. Also, it only eats in its larval stage, so it doesn't eat as an adult. So it's not a pest species. The reason that you consider houseflies a pest is that they live 3, 4, 5 weeks as an adult, and they're always looking for food, which is why they come into your house. The BSF isn't looking for food because it doesn't really eat as an adult. It's just looking for a partner to mate, lay eggs, and those eggs hatch into larvae, and they eat a lot.
Okay, so I think we're getting a good idea of some of the specifics of the process. You've brought this cage of billions of flies to life. What are we talking about in terms of the uses? So some of the things that crop up, I was in a pub the other day, and instead of peanuts on the bar, they had crickets. So insects for human consumption is one aspect of insects in food. There's also use for animal consumption. You're talking about using them to process food waste or upcycle food waste. What does AgriProtein focus on in that picture?
So if we just go back one step, I mean, humans have demonstrably disliked flies since about 3,500 BC. Know this because on the side of the pyramids, there's a hieroglyph of slaves holding an umbrella to keep the sun off the pharaoh, and somebody swapped the flies. The first person to really use flies in any useful manner was Genghis Khan, who would never go into battle without flies. So what he'd do is he'd go into battle with a wagon covered with rotting material. Flies would lay their eggs on it, he'd hatch the larvae, and he'd put them onto the wounds of his soldiers. That was retried by Napoleon Bonaparte's generals until he banned it. And in fact, larvae are now used by the National Health Service, both in the UK and in Germany, and in other parts of the world increasingly, to clean wounds that are not treatable by modern medicine. So flies have a lot of uses, and we've had a fairly poor relationship with them in terms of understanding what they do and the use they can be. But you wouldn't be here today if your ancestors hadn't eaten larvae and grubbits and flies. That's what they ate, right up through until humans started settling down 10, 12,000 years ago and farming. And of course, everybody in the West a third of the people around the world probably eat insects in one form or another. And the Western world has forgotten that actually it loves insects, but it only loves the insects of the seas. So lobsters, shrimp, mollusks, those sort of things. They clean up waste in the sea, just like flies and other things do in the terrestrial world. So insects for food is something that is definitely growing. And I think things like crickets are really useful in that sort of world. And they have a much better name than the black soldier fly. I mean, if you think about it, we adore monkfish. It used to be called dogfish for centuries. It was only thought fit for the dogs. Named it monkfish, everyone loves it. Perhaps the black soldier fly needs a makeover. I mean, if you get something like the mealworm, which one or two companies use, it already sounds quite attractive. It's a meal and it's a worm. It's less hassy than something that's, a soldier and a fly. And they're very unsoldier-like, and they don't fly much. They just potter around, really.
So that's a call out for our viewers at home, I think. If you can come up with an appetizing name for the black soldier fly, send them into the comments and we'll put them to Jason and see if he can sign off on any of those. What about this point around animal consumption then? So this is about using the flies or the fly larvae for feed for other animals. Talk us through that.
So the difference is feed or food. If you think about a fish leaps out of a stream and grabs a fly because that's what it's always done. A baby fish will go down to the bottom of the river after it's just been hatched and eat the eggs of other fish or the eggs of insects like a mayfly that might have laid its eggs in the water. So they have been eating flies forever and a day. If you think about a chicken in the field, a free-range chicken, what does it do? It scratches and it pecks, and it's looking for worms, it's looking for larvae, it's looking for ants, it's looking for insects. That's what they do, and that's what they eat. And in fact, at home at our farm, if you look at the chickens, the place they go first and foremost to look for larvae is in the dung heaps, because they, like Genghis Khan, have an understanding, innate, not obviously technical, that when a cell is breaking down in nature, two things want it. One is bacteria and the other is larvae. So therefore, larvae have some of the best antibiotic, which are called antimicrobial peptides, which they emit naturally to kill bacteria so that they can eat. When an animal eats those like a chicken, that natural antibiotic goes through to the chicken and its offspring. So it's only a natural process, and that's what's really interesting. And that's what fascinates us. So yes, food for humans or feed is very interesting. But the thing that we concentrate on is feed for animals. And I think there's two reasons for that. Firstly, the market is immense around the world. And secondly, we are devastating our seas through the excessive fishing and production of something called fish meal. So fish meal is hoovered up in the southern hemisphere near the pole. Small fish, plus anything else that happens to get caught in the nets. Mince it all up, cook it all up, then ship it to the northern hemisphere to put into fish farms, where, of course, the food ratio is negative. I mean, you're going to eat somewhere between 80 and 100 tons of food in your life, depending on how long you live. And to show how inefficient you are, you won't weigh anywhere near 80 or 100 tons. The same thing is true of other animals with one stomach. They eat more than they put on weight to themselves, called a food conversion ratio. So fish farming is, as it currently stands, although they've made huge strides, not frightfully sensible. It works for supermarkets because you can get a farmed salmon, a farmed trout, a farmed sea bass on Thursday afternoon rather than having some fisherman explain why the shelves are empty at your local supermarket because the fish weren't biting. So that's why we're really interested in the animal side of it and the production of feed for animals, because it's a large industrialized marketplace. It enables us to concentrate on a few buyers and focus on the technical similarity between flies and its replacement, which has been fish meal. Of course, we only started really using fish meal once we discovered sonar at the end of the last World War, because then there was no more fishing. It was just called catching, because you just went to where the fish were. And this is not either fair or a good way into the future. But getting rid of waste, or there's no such thing as waste really, there's just stuff in the wrong place, and converting it back using a natural process into something that we really need has to make sense. And that's what we do.
we've got some good questions coming in, so thanks for the people who are sending those in. We'll get to them in just a moment. Some questions specifically about the alternatives or the criticisms, but we'll get to those in just a moment. I just wanted to ask what the impact is currently, or the potential impact that you can see for when this is rolled out more widely or to date. So I'm still talking about whether that's carbon savings or land that doesn't have to be used to grow food for animals. What are the benefits of this?
I guess there's two or three things. Firstly, if you take, so a typical factory of ours takes over 90,000 tons of organic waste organic material that would otherwise go to landfill. When that breaks down anaerobically in landfill, of course, it emits a whole host of CO, from CO2 to methane and everything else that is harmful in terms of emissions. Secondly, there is always the possibility of leach from landfills contaminating water tables, which is why around the world most countries from the Middle East to Americas are banning organics to landfill. And the third thing is, I guess, we desperately need new novel sources of protein, and at the same time adding organic material in the form of what we call insect frass or insect, it's the compost that's left at the end of the process, back to our soils makes sense. You see in the United Nations 61 planting seasons left. We're depleting our soils so rapidly that to put our organic waste into landfill and holes in the sea, holes in the land or back out to sea is really not sensible. And so at AgriProtein, within our three brands that we operate, in fact, as the Insect Technology Group, AgriProtein is just one of the brands. We take a range of organic waste substrates and convert them back into protein and soils for use in a circular fashion back into the world of agriculture, as has always happened in nature, but we've just got so distant from nature that we've forgotten.
But I'm thinking if you think about all of the food that's going into animal feed now, through things like the fish meal you mentioned, do you get a sense of how much AgriProtein type technology could replace? Do we know? Is it half? Is it all of it?
No, because animal feed is a bit like human feed in one sense. You feed small babies very concentrated protein in the form of milk and that type of thing, and then as you get older, you need, as a human, you can probably live on very well on just a vegan diet, but most humans would like a bit of protein, a bit of starch, and a bit of carbohydrates. And it's exactly the same thing for an animal, in that the farmers are trying to get the best food conversion ratio, so the least input to the most output, and that is a balance of those things. So we concentrate on only feed for monogastric animals, that's animals with one stomach. That's fish, chickens, pigs, cats and dogs, funnily enough, and of course humans, which is why we're well adapted to eating insects and always have done. Whereas a cow can make all of its amino acids, these are the building blocks of protein that it needs, it can do that because it has multiple stomachs. Single-stomached entities like us can't do that, so we need to consume some of those proteins in a complete form or eat a much more complex diet.
So the future, animal feed in the future it'll have to have some diversity to it. This isn't just one size fits all.
Oh, no, so an animal diet is always complex, and there's a whole huge industries around nutritional balance for animals to make sure they get the correct mix of nutrients and proteins that they need to grow. So we will only ever be the replacement for the complete protein part of that. So that's fish meals used in agriculture predominantly, and of course in our pet foods.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Thank you for all the questions coming in so far. Some fantastic comments to put to Jason in just a moment. But there's loads on at the diff over the next few days, so here's Kimberly to tell you what's coming up.
Thank you for joining us on the first day of this November diff. We are really excited to see you there and hope you enjoy this session. We have a lot more sessions for you on the diff today. Tune in at 3 p.m. to learn about how the circular economy and the fourth industrial revolution can drive prosperity in Latin America. And at 4 p.m. to discuss the bio conundrum, bio-based materials in a circular future. We really hope to see you there, and as always, don't forget to use the hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter to comment and ask any questions. You can catch up on anything you missed and find the full schedule at thinkdiff.co or on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's YouTube channel.
Okay, welcome back to Diff from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm here with Jason Drew, the co-founder and CEO of AgriProtein, an insect protein firm. We've been hearing about the AgriProtein process, and it's got some of our viewers intrigued, pretty fired up. So let's get into a couple of the questions, Jason. So firstly, you mentioned actually diet changes just before the break there, and Ben Hopkins has said, the answer is veganism. Enough with this insect nonsense, please. So what role do diet shifts play? Is this propping up a type of consumption that is wrong from the outset?
So the answer is to consume less and to consume better, and of course to include less animal food in your diet. However, you cannot start off early life stages as a baby on a purely vegan diet. It just doesn't give you the nutrients and the protein balance you need to survive. So as we get older, yes, we can, of course, and the more plant-based material we consume, the better for the planet. That said, there's still a large part of the world that still wants to have fish and chicken as part of its diet and more complete proteins. And as we play into making a more sustainable world, we need to try and make that more sustainably, and not to use fish caught from our seas, but to use to make fish meal, but rather to use waste and recycle it. Even if we didn't feed the food sector with our proteins and just got rid of the organic waste that would otherwise go to landfill or build up, it has to make sense. So even if it's just producing soil and not the proteins, that would be a good step forward. Doing both and preventing waste, we think, is part of the solution of repairing the future, which from where I see it, it's broken.
Okay, thanks for the answer there. A couple more that we've had in. I'll take these two together. They're both a bit more about the process. Someone said, is there enough waste to feed your factories at scale? So I guess this is about volumes and collection. And Rachel's then put, does this make it more possible to localize food production in cities, for example, so around the geography of this?
So, yes. So we target cities with probably at this stage more than 1 million inhabitants. And that gives us more than sufficient waste to build 1 or 2 factories around those type of cities. In the Northern Hemisphere, the waste pits are always to the east of cities and the Southern Hemisphere to the west. That's where the waste is currently transported. That's driven by prevailing winds. That's why the East End is cheaper than the West End in the Northern Hemisphere, and very often vice versa in the Southern Hemisphere. So we interrupt those supply chains. So we provide a lot of less waste costs money to move, a ton per kilometre, per ton per kilometre distance moved. And so by interrupting those, we can make protein much nearer to the cities that generate the waste. And that's helpful and useful. We also then don't need to, for example, move fish meal from the Southern Hemisphere, where it's produced, to the Northern Hemisphere, where it's consumed. We can make protein in the Northern Hemisphere, where it's used. So cutting down on carbon miles, cutting down on landfill, and cutting down on, or rather starting to generate some reasonable volumes and contribution towards adding compost back to our soils. And
we haven't actually spoken about where this is happening now. I mean, you've given us some. You suggested there is this uptake around the world, and certain countries are more open to this development than others. But where are the hotspots now?
I think everywhere is a hotspot. Each market is very different. So, and we have the 2 major we have the input, which is the waste, and we have the output, which is the protein and the soil. So you can't move the waste, so you need to therefore have your factories near the cities. You can't move really the compost, so you need to put it in or factories in countries where compost has a value. For example, in Hong Kong, it has no value because there's no agricultural business on the island of Hong Kong, but a huge amount of waste. So it's also driven by gate fees and people's understanding of how much it costs to get rid of waste. So Europe is a very interesting market. Our first factory will be complete in the Netherlands in, I think, March or May next year. Our factory in California is complete structurally. It'll take another year to finish our permitting there. We're also pushing quite hard into Asia, particularly into Japan and South Korea, which have very developed food collection and separation structures. And we add more value than just composting that waste because we produce protein from it and we also produce compost. So around the world, it is beginning to take off. Then I think we will see in later years a more diverse structure where smaller communities are able to process their waste and then transport the larvae and the compost for further processing at central locations. So with anything, you start with the larger scale things and then move down the chain to smaller opportunities. And it takes as much effort from us in terms of construction, commissioning, biological teams to build a smaller factory as it does to build one of our standard 250 ton a day input of waste factories.
Do you run into any challenges around where you put these? Because when you described it, a cage of how many billion, 8 billion flies, it's do people not want that near their house?
Well, I think there's two or three things. We run a biosecure facility. We don't want anything coming in. We don't want anything getting out. Just because we happen to farm quite small livestock, it doesn't mean we want our livestock to disappear. And so we run biosecure facilities. We also use the black soldier fly, which, as I mentioned before, is a non-invasive creature. So in the unlikely event we have a tornado rip through the middle of one of our factories, then the flies are in cages within sealed rooms. So there may be some escape, but very unlikely. And even then, if you look outside wherever you're sitting today, there are already as many flies as the environment can contain. If you were to add loads more in there, they would die off quickly because there's not, even if the environmental conditions were perfect. And so where you are today, it might be a small number of days a year in which the conditions are perfect. And if it was cold, any escapees would last a very short period of time, hours. So, we build our factories in a logical, coherent manner. They're designed to maintain the best conditions for our larvae and our flies at all their life stages. And in countries like California, one has to comply with earthquake codes, so that even in the event of an earthquake, there's unlikely to be any risk to our factory situation. So, a factory is a very large and very expensive thing to put together, and it's very well engineered and designed to be fit for purpose.
So we've had a question here from Gary who says, I get frustrated when I hear about ideas like this because they seem so logical and simple. Why isn't this happening more widely? Why can't we just get on with it?
So I think there's two or three things. It's a very easy business to conceptualize. It goes on at small scale around you all day long. To get it to a large industrial scale has taken us, as I said earlier, many years of failure and probably $50 million of investment in the early stages. We raised another $105 million last year, which will help us build the next couple of factories. But with a factory costing, sort of $40 million, it's a capital-intensive business as well. To get it right at the scale that regulators, cities, local inhabitants, and governments will enable and facilitate and take seriously. So it's not that easy a process. If anything was easy, everyone would do it.
Okay, more difficult than it sounds then. Just wanted to take us off in a couple of different angles here. You mentioned earlier, you said it a couple of times during this conversation that agroprotein is just industrializing something natural. Isn't the industrialization of natural processes kind of what got us into the food system that we have at the moment, and with all its shortcomings, because plants grow, and you could go out and pick an apple off a wild tree, or some blackberries probably at this time of year. But the industrialization of those natural processes comes with its own downfalls and problems. So is that a safe route to go down?
Well, if you look at how on earth we're going to feed 9 billion people, you need to look at things a bit differently. So, every day there's 375,000 of us born, 170,000 of us die. That means that this evening 205,000 more people will sit down for supper than had breakfast this morning. So how on earth are you going to feed these people? And the answer is not by cutting down more forests to provide more farmland to grow more things, nor is it by fishing harder and deeper our seas. These people have a right to food as much as the previous generations did. It is, as I see it, only a peak population issue. And I think we've pretty much cracked the population growth issues most places in the world. And I say that because if you look at the World Health Organization report on populations, you can see some clear trends. So if every woman in her lifetime has 2.1 children, the population stays flat. People look at Europe, where the birth rates fall into 1.6 or 1.7. Without migration, our population would shrink. And you look at places like Pakistan or Brazil, and you see very large growth rates for the nation as a whole. Actually, it's not true. What's true is that in the countryside, they have birth rates of over 4, 4.5. In the cities, they have birth rates less than that of Europe, like 1.1, because in the countryside, children add to your economic activity. In cities, they detract from your economic activity. So in truth, cities are the only effective form of contraception that mankind has ever invented. And as everyone is moving to cities, I believe we only have a peak population to deal with. And as people move to cities, there is less opportunities for us to potter outside and go and find an apple tree. And because cities are built always on our prime farmland, so every mega city in the world is built on flat land around river estuaries. I think there's only 2 cities in the world with mega populations or very large populations that aren't built on city estuaries. It's Johannesburg and another city in India, which I can't remember, which were recent creation. Johannesburg because of the gold rush, and so otherwise we build cities on our best farmland, and we can't afford to continue to do that. Nor can we afford city sprawl. What we need to do is build up and let people live together, where you can deliver education and healthcare and other vital things. But we can't necessarily provide green spaces for everyone to go and pick their apples off wild trees.
So this is about a better, it is industrial, but a better form of it that doesn't look like the industrial systems that we've had in the past.
I guess it's less bad. The population growth is what it is. I've explained why I think it is only a peak population we'll hit. And in that time, we need to make sure that everybody can live as well as they can, given the resources we have, which are limited. And if we're not to be constrained by those resources, we need to think differently. And we need to get on repairing the future.
Thanks for that. I have a question here about biodiversity, which we haven't really got into very much so far. But I know it's something you're passionate about. I was reading another interview that you did where you said, "The current mass extinction of insect species concerns me more than the plight of the rhino, as it will have consequences for food production and biodiversity that we barely comprehend." Building on this idea of agroprotein as a industrialized natural process, what is the link between your process, your technology, and biodiversity or insect diversity?
Well, I think it's probably easy to separate that out into 2 different questions. We are, through the wanton use of pesticides, wiping out entire ecosystems, and we really don't understand the connection between insects and what they have done for humanity, or very little of it. So we need to keep biodiversity, and as we wipe out insects in cities, as we wipe out insects in fields, everyone's aware of the problem we have with our bees at the moment. Who on earth is going to pollinate our plants? And this is a challenge. So that's one side of the biodiversity and why I'm particularly keen about them with insects. Everyone can see the rhinos disappearing, being hunted to extinction, but few people really get excised about the disappearance of another few 10,000 species of flies around the world because we wipe them out with pesticides. And all of those things have a particular gap in nature, and everything. I'm the only animal I can think on this planet that has no particular use is humans.
Thanks.
So we're very keen on. I'm passionate about maintaining biodiversity, and what do we do into that space? Well, fish meal is produced by catching wild fish that are ground up. It goes as bad as krill fishing, which is really taking the bottom of the food chain. And if as humans, we're eating to the bottom of the food chain, and it's easier to catch krill than it is whales, because people don't like whales being hunted, but they don't notice krill or care about krill, on which whales and many other fish species survive and thrive. If we can leave more fish in the seas, which we can do as a result of replacing fish meal with what we do, this is a better thing for the billion plus people who live on subsistence fishing to survive, and indeed our industrial agricultural processes that, for the moment, still use far too much of our natural resources.
Thank you, Jason. I'm not going to recommend you a career in motivational speaking after the statement that humans have no purpose. But I get the point. Last question from me, actually, and then we'll take a look at some of the others coming in. So food waste is a really important part of the AgriProtein process. At the same time, as we said at the top of the show, food waste is such a problem, and we're told that we should be trying to reduce it. So how much food waste is acceptable?
Very little is the answer. But so we've got two different types of food waste. We've got the pre-consumer waste and the post-consumer waste. So pre-consumer waste is, for example, you imagine peeling a potato to make potato chips from, and you throw away those potato peelings, or you can repurpose them into the agricultural sector. So that's pre-consumer waste. Then you've got post-consumer waste, things that have gone off, out of date, or you just simply haven't eaten at a large buffet and get thrown away after that. And those are two different substrates that can be used in different marketplaces and different times. We also have a third business in the group that concentrates uniquely on manures, everything from human sewerage to animal manures, and converting those back into useful protein rather than putting them into the seas or into huge pits in the ground. So we're looking at the whole food, pre-food, post-food, indeed post-animal usage. And I think as we get into a more sustainable future, we need to really close the loop on everything from pre-consumer, post-consumer, and post-consumption waste, so that we really repurpose everything from food waste to manures.
But you're not concerned that we'll get so good at reducing food waste that there won't be enough coming in the doors at one of your factories?
I can't wait for that day. I'd love to be able to close up and say we've done a great job.
Okay, question.
Get someone away.
Question coming online, and thanks for your questions that you've been sending in throughout the session for Jason. We've spoken a lot about flies. I feel like I've had a crash course in the mating rituals of flies. But what about other types of insect? Any interest there? Are there other types of insect that you could see expanding your operations to in the future?
So we probably put about 2% of our R&D budget into looking at other insects and other insect types and looking at what they can do. And there's some interesting early work being done on things like the wax moth and whether they can consume plastics, and lots of other insects. I think we're probably 10 or 20 years away from understanding how much we don't know. And it's exciting, but in the short term, we keep a very focused eye. We need to be a commercial business because we need to generate profits, to go and build more factories, to go and do more good. And without that, it doesn't work. So we allow our teams to dabble in the future, but we also remain very commercially focused on addressing the real issues now, here today, because if you don't address those issues, then it's nothing else but good ideas. The world's full of those. What you need to do is have good ideas that are implemented and work.
I heard spiders were particularly tricky. Have you looked at those? They eat each other, don't they?
A podcast this morning about the Australian spider life, from jumping spiders to everything else, and they're a fascinating creature. But no, it's not something we focused on. We really think that there's 2 or 3 fly species that are really going to be very useful in our closing a loop in agriculture and helping to tackle waste. I mean, flies have a fascinating history. They were the first animal into space, obviously. NASA put up flies because you can see the whole life cycle in a short number of weeks, bring them back down and see whether, what happened to them. Much easier to clean up after a few hundred flies than it would be a few hundred dogs in a spacecraft. And it was the second animal after human to have its genome mapped. I mean, the fly's got a fascinating past and a fascinating future.
Jason, I think we could go on and on with your trivia on flies and where landfills end up in cities on the east or the west end, but you've given us a lot of your time today and a lot of insights about the AgriProtein and the future food system. So thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts with the DIF today.
Thank you very much for having me on board. Lovely to spend some time with you.
So flies, they might seem like a pest, but with some soft mood lighting and a bit of Barry White, you can train them to create a future food system. Thank you very much for joining us here at the DIF from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation today. There's loads more coming up over the next few days, so check out the DIF schedule online at thinkdiff.co. Thanks for joining today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
We need to start making more conscious material choices.
Set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.